is growing up in what I think was a very haunted house by Small Cat.
This one is about a house I lived in as a teenager. It does have mention of suicide and self-harm, so apologies for that. A little bit of background info for you. We moved from a small, cozy home to a much larger old Victorian terraced house in a busy part of the city. The house had been an old shop and had a separate part, a new annex that had been built along the side of it. This was perfect, as we had moved to accommodate my Nan, who needed care around the clock, but didn't want to move her into a nursing home yet. The house was huge, with a long, tree-lined garden. The newer parts were light and airy. The oldest parts of the building were, despite a lot of renovation, still dark and creepy. It wasn't ideal, as the area wasn't great, but my parents needed somewhere quickly, and it was the best available. Mom worked long hours in a sales job, and Dad schooled myself and my sister at home. This meant that we could also help care for Nan when Mom wasn't around. The 5 or so years that we lived there were very stressful, to say the least. With money worries and health worries for our Nan, who sadly had dementia, I won't go into huge detail, but I just wanted to paint the picture for you. As mentioned before, my parents were heavily into spiritual and supernatural things, but more in an investigative way. Dad had previously worked as a medium, but had distanced himself from the scene due to not taking people seriously anymore and feeling a bit disillusioned with the whole thing. Anyway, on to the experiences. My sister, being a bit of a princess, had bagged the largest bedroom for herself when we moved in. It also happened to be part of the new build, and I was left with the smaller, dark room at the top of the stairs. I didn't mind too much, as we had previously had to share. It was just nice to have my own space. The bedrooms were connected via a long, rather narrow and gloomy landing, which had a bathroom in the middle. My sister's bedroom was right at the end, and it was above the new kitchen and annex. My room was typically old-fashioned, with a large bricked-up fireplace and dated floral wallpaper. The first night I slept in there, I was nervous for no good reason, and I didn't sleep well the whole night. I put this down to it being a new space, but honestly, the feeling never really left during my time there. This part of my life was not great. I was dealing with being a teenager and feeling lonely due to being home educated and not having many friends. There was also the stress of helping look after Nan, who needed total care, and the added bonus of being bullied by local children. I struggled with extreme depression and began to have really dark and negative thoughts toward myself. I'm not blaming the house for this, but it certainly seemed to amplify the atmosphere of those feelings somehow. This might sound weird, but I believe that whatever was there fed off my negativity, intensified the activity. The first things that happened were small. Doors opening and closing, things going missing for no reason and then turning up in random places, knockings and tappings on the wall. Dad tried not to scare us by talking about it, but he later said that he always felt a pressure in that house and knew that there was at least one entity there. I think the first big thing for me was seeing a large black triangle of smoke drift slowly across the room and then disappear into the wall. The whole experience lasted around 20 seconds, and my brain really didn't have time to process it properly. But the shape had been a perfect triangle. No one believed me when I told them, and I can't quite explain it still. Next came large orbs of light that would zip across the room, and more often than not seemingly go upstairs and disappear. This was not only seen by me, but the whole family. Mom blamed car headlights, but we would usually have the heavy curtains drawn, and no other real sources of moving light were in the place. The orbs would vary in size, more often than not being around the size of a closed fist. This was followed by tappings and knockings on the wall as they appeared and then disappeared up the staircase. Whatever was there liked to move things around. Mom and Dad liked to collect ornaments, and we had a few around the television, one being this cool stone statue of a hooded lady with a small crystal ball on her lap. Dad and I were playing computer games one day when the stone statue suddenly lifted maybe 20 centimeters off the television and then slammed back down again with enough force to make a loud bang. That was the beginning of the more intense activity. I began to hear my name being called. This would only happen when I was downstairs in the dining room that was linked to the staircase upstairs. I would hear a voice, sometimes female and sometimes male, calling me by name seemingly from upstairs. It freaked me out, but I didn't want to say anything to my parents, as they were stressed enough at this point with Nan, and without me adding disembodied voices to their list. During this time, my depression intensified, and I began harming myself and having very bleak, suicidal thoughts. In the night, I would see dark shapes in my bedroom and flashing lights, but I was just too numb to care anymore, and I would disregard them. I had a small cat that used to come into my bedroom as he hated the dog, and would come in through my window one night to get some peace. Every night at around 3 a.m., without fail, he would leap from my bed and scramble to get out of the window again. I put this down to being a weird cat thing, but at 3 a.m. the atmosphere in my room would also change, becoming much colder and darker. This would be when I saw shadows and lights. I told no one of this, thinking that possibly it was all in my head. One night, Mom was out working, and I was awake, keeping an ear out in case my Nan woke up and needed help, as she frequently got confused and asked for a cup of tea late into the night. I suddenly heard a blasting noise, like a loud radio, then doors slamming, followed by the sound of my sister screaming in terror. She ran into my room, beside herself with fear. Once she had calmed down, she explained that her radio had suddenly turned itself on at full volume, and at the same time all of her windows and doors had opened. Indeed, when I went to investigate, her windows were all open, and the radio was blasting static through the speakers. She slept with me in my room that night, and then told me the following day that she would rather sleep in her room after all than stay in mine again. It was just creepy, she told me. All of this was weird, but then came the time that I physically saw what I think was an apparition. I haven't talked about the upstairs bathroom yet. It was seemingly normal, but definitely had the strangest vibe of all the rooms in the house. I didn't like going up there, as it felt like someone was watching, but it was the nearest bathroom to me and the only one with a shower, so I used it reluctantly. One day I was brushing my teeth at the sink when I looked up and saw in the mirror behind me a woman in a white dressing gown. She looked to be around 30, with long blonde hair and dark circles under her eyes. She stood directly behind me and was staring at my reflection with a very blank, heavy gaze. I had never seen her before in my life. She looked completely real, but I got such a feeling of wrongness and fear that I just dropped the toothbrush and ran. Of course, no one else had been visiting, and the rest of the family were downstairs. This shook me up so much, I refused to go into that bathroom for a while, and would wash my hair in the kitchen sink instead of showering. I told no one about her, but tried to draw from memory in my sketchbook. I'm a pretty good artist, but the picture I drew is technically flawless, and not something that a 14-year-old girl would be able to produce. That scared me so much that I burnt the picture straight after, and tried to forget about it. One day during the worst bit of my depression, I was reading in the dining room. My dad had laid down for a bit on the sofa in the next room, and I assumed that he was asleep. My parents were also super stressed at this time, and he was probably tired and feeling run down. After a while, he walked into the dining room and gave me a strange look. Now, bear in mind that he used to work and make a living from being a medium for this next bit. He asked me who had been visiting my room in the night. Confused, I replied that no one had. He went blank for a second, kind of switched off, and then said, No, there's a woman, and you've been seeing stuff in your room." Of course, I knew exactly then what he meant, but not wanting my folks to know, I still denied it. He went quiet again, and then told me that someone had told him about the woman that I had seen, and that I was in danger of hurting myself, and that she was feeding off of me. All of this hit home, and I finally broke down and explained all of it, even the self-harm and suicide attempts. I hated upsetting my parents, but it was what needed to happen. Later, Dad went up to cleanse my room. He didn't seem satisfied afterwards, however, and my parents renovated the summer house in the garden to be my new bedroom. It was damned cold in winter, but I instantly felt lighter and better in there. There was no longer that constant dread. Towards the end of our time there, we learned a little bit about the previous owners from an old neighbor. I have no idea if any of this is true, as I never found any proof, but I certainly need to include it. Apparently, in the late 90s, a family had lived in the old shop. Something was wrong with the older daughter, who had mental health issues and had sadly ended up taking her own life in the city park one night. Like I said, I don't know if this is true, as I never asked for her name, but it does make me wonder if part of her never left the house, and if she had used my bedroom before me. It would certainly explain a lot of the activity, and it would certainly explain why I felt encouraged in my depression and suicide attempt.
Cousin Molly's Tale by Lady Grey 1174.
My cousin Molly, for clarity's sake, and her family live in a large Victorian that they've extensively renovated over the years to accommodate a family of 7. Now, living in a Victorian house with 4 full floors, including a livable attic with a bathroom, kitchen, living room and bedroom, which they rent out to local college students, you would think ghost stories would abound in this place. But that wasn't the case. They've never noticed anything strange at all in the house, despite the few creaks and groans houses like that give out when their joints ache. Molly's mom and dad gutted the basement, added an outside entrance and converted the whole thing of it, turning it to a perfect area for my aunt's daycare. After the conversion was complete, the daycare room was warm, welcoming and usually filled with children's laughter. However, Molly noticed the daycare room felt cold and slightly strange once the children left for the day. She chalked it up to the room no longer being filled with the children's happy energy, and would retrieve whatever was needed from the room and head back upstairs into the butler's pantry off the kitchen. The first floor of the house was laid out rather simply. You walked through the front door into a tiny foyer, which opened onto the left of the dining room, on the right to the formal parlor, and ahead was the staircase leading to the second floor landing. The hall then ran parallel to the staircase back into the family room and the sunroom at the back. A small, one-person wide hallway ran from the family room behind the stairs into the kitchen. Molly was in high school at the time and pleaded with her mom to let her invite some friends over to study and to spend the night. Her mom finally agreed. She and Molly's dad would take her brothers to the movies, and Molly was allowed to invite 2 girlfriends over to spend the night. However, when Molly's parents got home, she was alone in the family room and looked like she'd been crying for a while. Molly explained her 2 friends had been invited, but only one could come and spend the night. Both girls arrived. The 3 of them joked and talked, getting very little studying done before the pizza arrived, and all thought of study simply evaporated. Finally, it came time for Molly's one friend to leave. Her parent picked her up, leaving Molly, and we'll call her Jenna, to spend the rest of the night laughing and talking. But as the night wore on, Molly decided to clean up the family room and go change into PJs in her bedroom. Jenna stayed in the family room, putting away the unused textbooks and notes. Finally, she curled up on the couch and turned on the telly, watching some silly show. After only a few moments, though, Jenna said she felt cold and thought she heard a banging noise from somewhere in the direction of the kitchen. Thinking Molly was still cleaning up, she didn't pay much attention to it and focused on the show. Minutes ticked by, and Jenna heard a strange clicking sound, which she said sounded oddly like a dog's nails on a wooden floor. Amused, she thought perhaps Molly was wearing some slippers or shoes that tapped when she walked. Turning to see what Molly was wearing, she was confused at first not to see Molly in the hallway. Then she looked down. On the floor of the hallway was a man, or what may have been a man at some point in his miserable life. He was gaunt and looked filthy. His clothes were ragged and a washed-out grey-green color. His hair was long, grey, white, and wild, to match the almost feral look in his eyes. In the split second before she screamed, she realized the clicking sound was from the long fingernails he was using to pull himself along the hallway floor. Molly claimed that by the time she reached the bottom of the stairs and ran into the family room, Jenna was curled into a tight ball in the corner of the couch, crying hysterically. She managed to calm her friend enough to find out what happened, but reassured her that no one else was in the house. Jenna wouldn't accept Molly's explanation and asked her friend to call her parents so she could leave. Molly obliged, of course, but was distraught that her friend had left after believing she was about to be attacked by some creature. Molly's parents then sighed, and her mom told her what they believe may have happened. During a certain period of history, it was considered shameful to have a family member with mental health issues, mental disabilities, or physical disabilities of any kind. While things improved a bit over time, it was still an accepted practice to simply not talk about those family members who would be sent away to private hospitals or sanitariums. However, not all families were willing to admit that such family members even existed, and would lock those poor souls away either in the attic or the basement, out of the way of the rest of the family. They were terribly treated in some cases, abused beyond mention. On some occasions, the wretch would escape from their confinement. Molly's mom said she believed what Jenna saw may have been the memory of one of those family members. There hadn't been overwhelming evidence to conclude that someone may have been held in the basement, but during the renovation they had found remnants of what could have been a makeshift room. They simply believed it had been used as a storage room or cold cellar at the time, but there may have been a different purpose altogether.
An experience I had at my home. By fuck, I missed.
So, first, a little context. My house was built in 1599 for a wealthy farming family. The house has had extensions from the Victorian era and most recently the 70s, but much of the original home remains. It was a couple of days ago, but I was in my living room half watching the news and half on my phone. My dog, who was very old and chilled back greyhound, suddenly jerked up from the sofa and looked directly to our window doors, looking down at the garden. At the time, the curtains were closed, so I thought he maybe had heard a fox or had been disturbed by a pesky fly or something. And because I know that dogs can sometimes sense ghosts, I jokingly asked if Granddad had popped in to say hello. He was still staring, and then suddenly something tapped the back door quite loudly. Thinking it could be a fox, maybe after the chickens, I stood up and opened the curtains and looked out. Dark, but no fox. Then I heard it. It was almost like breathing. At first, I thought it was the dog, but as I looked at him, he was facing the other way. Yet I heard breathing, quiet, but inside the room. I thought I had overreacted, and it was my own breathing, so I sat down. But it persisted and got slightly louder, and then I felt dizzy. It was like it was getting more intense, yet not louder. It felt like that dizziness you get when you sit up too fast from sitting for a long time. But that made no sense, as I had been on my feet and just fine minutes ago. I don't know how to say it, but it got worse, and I could feel myself panicking despite my efforts to stay calm, which surprisingly did not work. And soon it was too much. I went out of the room and upstairs into my own rooms and stayed up there for the rest of the night. What made it worse is that when I sat there trying to comprehend what just happened, I thought I heard footsteps just below me.
Huge Victorian mansion, suspiciously cheap, creepy vibe in the basement, equal my 100% true experience. That was confirmed by a medium. Bar ran U412.
Although my experience starts off like every haunting movie, I promise this is exactly how it went down. My best friend flips houses and found this huge Victorian mansion that went into foreclosure and was up for auction. He was the only bidder and paid next to nothing for this house. His plan was to demo and update as much as he could on his own, and I was there almost every day to help in any way I could. It got me out of my house, kept my mind off things, and taught me a thing or two about renovating houses. It was a win-win for both of us, so I thought. Besides the whole place having a cold, abandoned feeling, the only place that made my stomach turn was a specific room in the basement. I felt like I could pinpoint the exact corner where the bad vibes were coming from, and voiced this to my friend and his girlfriend many times. I could barely step foot into this room, and it felt like an invisible barrier was in front of me. Once I went into the room, I felt sick, bothered, and sad. This has never happened to me before. One night we were out in the front porch when a neighbor came over and started talking about the house and the history of it. He said that it was one of the first ones built in the town. It was the only one part of the Underground Railroad. How fucking cool is that? At one time a firehouse, and then later a funeral home. We thought it was pretty cool and went to Google to find out more. Unfortunately, all of the history stuff like that was only at the library, so our search stopped there. One day, I arrived at the house before my friend did. He told me to go inside and start getting things ready. Side note, at this point, the only working bathroom was in the basement, and I was the only one in the house. I started getting things ready on the main floor, but kept catching glimpses of things out of the corner of my eye. It happened enough times to thoroughly freak me out. Some time passed, and my friend still wasn't there, when my urge to pee became too great to ignore. I only had one inside option, in the basement next to the creepy room. I was about 25 at the time, and was so afraid to go into the basement that I peed outside in broad daylight where numerous neighbors could have seen. Also, I'm a girl, so it was pretty clear what I was doing. This was how scared I was. After my friend's girlfriend had some creepy vibes later, she decided to find a medium to come stay the night and do a full-blown Ghost Adventures lockdown. I'm super into creepy stuff, even though I was super scared as well, so I was excited to be a part of it and hear if they found anything. The mediums did not want to know anything about the house or any experiences we had before they did their investigation. The next day after lockdown, we sat down with the medium and her team to discuss their findings. I shit you not, the medium said they found a spirit of a slave that had not crossed over. He was in the basement of the house when it was part of the Underground Railroad. The medium noted he was afraid of people and saw him cowering in one corner. It was the same room and the exact same corner that made me feel uneasy and sick to my stomach. I visibly turned white as a ghost, and every hair on my body was sticking up. The medium noticed my reaction, and I told her about my weird vibes and the stories the neighbor had told us. She said she could tell I was sensitive and in tune to the other energies around us that other people can't see or feel.
Haunted House by Audrey de Barkville.
In the early 1980s, my parents bought a tall, dilapidated Victorian terraced house in what is now quite a prestigious part of West London. They did not have much money and desperately needed to be in the area for work quickly. As a result, the house they bought was shabby and run down. It was lived in by an elderly spinster who let out bedsits. Each of the rooms in the house, bar her ground floor flat, had a kitchenette and a shower room clumsily partitioned out of it. On moving in, the back wall of the house was unstable and had to be taken down, all 5 stories of it. For one winter, we lived in the house with a temporary back wall of wood and tarpaulin, and for a short period, we were with no electricity as the wiring needed redoing. I remember doing homework on a tray with candles that would one day become our dining room. As the house was gradually done up, it reached the stage where my sister and I each had a bedroom on the 5th floor, and my parents had a bedroom and bathroom on the floor below. I do remember being bad at getting to sleep as a child and pulling the covers over my head to hide from whatever was out there. My family moved out of the house about 8 years later when I was around 14 and my sister was 2 years younger. About 10 years after that, my sister and I both had left home and were working. My parents lived in the country by that stage. One weekend, we were both staying with my parents because it was the birthday of one of them. We all went out to dinner at a pub near the house, which was a family tradition on birthdays when we can all get together. During the course of the meal, my mother made a slightly jibing comment about how my sister was much better at sleeping at nights these days. My mother remembered how, when we lived in London, my sister had always left her room after being put to bed and had come down and lain in my parents' bed. When they all went to bed, they picked her up and carried her up to her own bed to sleep. My sister responded immediately, "That's because the house was haunted." My mother is a skeptic about the supernatural, so she replied, "What rubbish." I pricked up my ears and questioned my sister. "Have we ever spoken about a haunting before?" "No," she said. "Which particular part of the house was haunted?" "The 5th floor," she replied. "Did you ever actually see anything?" "No, but I felt it." "If you felt it, can you say if it was male or female, old or young, with any distinguishing features?" "It was an old man with a beard," she answered without hesitating. "I agree," I said. "Did you experience anything else?" "Yes. I had nightmares about falling to my death from your bedroom window."